Today we are going to kind of continue on with doing some more of our cane demonstration. So using a nice advanced technique of patterning the glass using kind of filaments of color to create a nice striping design throughout the form. So my name is Colin. I'm going to be narrating and assisting for Jake here, who's in the role that we call the gaffer. So the gaffer in any hot shop has total creative control in whatever is being made in that hot shop per se. So starting off, Jake's just going to get this plate nice and hot, kind of preheat it a little bit while I go over a little bit of our equipment for those that are just tuning in for the first time and seeing glass blowing. This is pretty much what a hot shop looks like. So we have the reheating chamber, which Jake is going into. It's just a nice big drum of fire. It's holding at 2,150 degrees Fahrenheit. Same for our furnace over here. So all of our equipment is powered by natural gas and forced air. Our furnace is the heart and soul of our studio. So in there is where all of our molten glass sits in a ceramic crucible, or like kind of a large cereal bowl. And at its fullest is about 500 pounds in there. So we have our furnace that runs all year long for up to about 5 to 7 years before we have to turn it off for any emergency repairs. And then next to it we have our pipe warmer. This houses all of our pipes and punnies that actually will allow us to inflate the glass or continue to shape it. So we have to preheat the ends up to about 900 degrees, or looking kind of at this punny here, we're looking for that nice kind of cherry red glow to it. That's how we know it's nice and hot and glass will actually want to stick to it. If we tried gathering glass with cold pipes or cold metal, it's not really going to adhere as well, and all that heat will actually get taken out by the metal itself. So we do like heating those up. So Jake here, we've been talking about this demonstration a little beforehand, right behind you. He's going to be making a cone form with a nice kind of T-top lip, which I can explain a little bit further in the demonstration. So it looks like we've heated up this plate, just kind of gauging it from the back of our hand. Yeah, I think might be a little bit more, yeah. So we're kind of gauging the heat by based on experience. So with people that work a lot in cane and patterning, we have to use different types of, we have kiln shelves here, which is just a large ceramic plate. We'll heat up, lay the canes onto, so those will kind of soak some heat up. And we just want to make sure it's nice and hot so those canes will actually get warm and want to be tacky enough to actually fuse to a collar eventually, or not get thermally shocked when we introduce them back into the reheating chamber to fuse them up a little bit. So while he's doing that, I'll explain a little bit about some kind of color applications we can do and how we would actually pull canes. So today, Jake's got a nice kind of layout of canes using 3 different colors. We have a nice kind of coral pink, a canary yellow, and it looks like a little bit of a gray color. So he's got these kind of alternating, like 2 pink, 2 yellow, and 2 gray, or kind of in that same variation. Right now that we have to explore a little bit, spend some time doing, and getting all those canes laid out. And so you can see the kiln shelf. We actually have these 2 metal bars here on each end. These are what we call ferretti. They're just little rectangle or square stock, just pieces of metal that act almost as borders. So it's going to keep those canes from falling off the plate. And they've been wiped with a little bit of chalk. That acts as kind of like PAM, or like a non-stick coating. That way, as those canes heat up, anything that, usually when glass is hot, if that metal heats up as well, they're going to stick to one another. Same thing with like how we have to preheat our pipes. So with having that little coating, it's not going to allow it to stick. And the same thing goes for the kiln shelf as well. It has kiln wash on there. So that allows those canes to not really adhere to that shelf. Now, if we were to get that shelf ripping hot, those canes would stick pretty easily. But we've done this many times, so you know, that never really happens anymore. So he's just lining it up, making sure it's all nice and even, and then we got our pie dividers right here. So the pie dividers is a really handy tool for us. So what he's going to do is measure. You can see him measuring the length from the edge of this cane to about 1 cane short on the other side. And that's going to actually multiply it by pi and do the math for us. So it gives him the diameter of a collar that he needs. What's up? Circumference. Sorry. So now we're just going to let the canes heat up a little bit, and then I'll take over and start actually heating them up. We'll end up flipping the plate so they heat up nice and evenly, while Jake keeps heating just the head of his pipe, looking for a little bit of that cherry glow. So glass blowing, it's a nice kind of two-man team. So I'm going to be here heating the plate for him while he can mainly focus on getting that collar all set up. Now Jake, he probably do this process all by himself, but it's really nice having another person there to help lend a hand and take these heats. It just takes a little extra weight off his shoulders with having to do extra stuff. So Jake just went into that furnace, turning 365 degrees, 360 degrees, and gathered up a little glass on the head of his blowpipe. And then what he did was go back in there after popping a little hole. That just exposes an air channel, and he's going to go in and kind of ream that open a little bit. That just exposes the air channel, so when he actually rolls this cane up and blows into it, he's not having to blow through excess clear glass. And so what he's going to be trying to do is actually match that glass, the circumference of that glass, or the diameter of it, to his pie calipers that he has set. I'm going to need to flip this. So, got them a little bit hotter. Now what we're going to do is just flip the plate, because when we're actually in the reheating chamber, we have what we call a ribbon burner, and that's just hanging out on the left-hand side. So if I were to heat the canes continually in and out without flipping the plate, only one side's going to get mainly blasted with heat. So by flipping it, it just makes sure the heat's going nice and evenly throughout it. So I'm going to do a couple more heats, make sure these canes are nice and actually kind of tacked together in a sheet, so he can roll them up almost like a curtain onto his collar. So you can see him shaping up that glass with those jacks, exposing a little bit of glass off the head of his pipe. And while I'm in here, I'm actually looking for some of the canes, the edges, to actually start softening and rounding over. That's how I know that they're starting to get hot enough to where they want to start tacking together, but not too hot to where they start sticking to the plate. So mainly just kind of gauging it based off experience. You learn kind of a handful of times doing this process starting out that you get them too hot and they get stuck to the plate. It's kind of a nightmare to get them off. So I don't know if you can see that on your camera, but we got a nice glow to them right now. So we just got to make sure we're both at the right temperature. Now Jay can be a little bit on the colder side. We're just looking for these canes to be hot. If his collar was really nice and gooey hot, they kind of can deform when he's rolling up those canes and just make the process a little bit harder. How are you thinking? Good?
That'd be good, yeah. All right, go for it. Yeah, we can come out. Take a last one last.
So I'm gonna come out. And I'm gonna knock these little ferrettes off, make sure they're not in the way. And give it a little tap on the plate. That makes sure that none of the canes, if they are stuck just the slightest bit, they just release a little. Now he's gonna stick this down and just kind of roll it up. And you can see how those canes are nice and hot nice and malleable to where they can just lift up instantly. And I'd call that a nice successful roll up right there. So now, with that kiln wash being on those canes, it's just a little powdery residue for us. So he just took this little whisk broom, kind of brushed it a little bit, knocking off any of that powder. And so now it's just time to kind of seal up that curtain. So he's going to take his tweezers and he's just going to go slowly kind of pinching at it on both sides, trying to bring those canes together so he can seal up that curtain. And by doing cane, whenever we seal up the curtain and then also close off the end, we're creating our own bubble. So we don't actually have to gather that glass over and start it kind of in a traditional form. So you can see him kind of going in, using the pincers or the tweezers, kind of pinch those two ends shut, kind of in and out. And once we have him pretty much closed up, he'll probably switch to his jacks and just kind of go up and down the rails, squeezing his jacks together just slightly. And that makes us, it ensures the fact that it is totally sealed up. So you can see all that beautiful kind of patterning going on with the double stripes. So all the colors, they're not exactly going to look true to how they looked when I showed you in the camera, just because they're really hot right now. At 2,000 degrees, anything's not really going to look like itself. So throughout the process, the colors might change a little bit. The yellow usually turns a little more orange. And the pink is kind of staying pretty pink, honestly. I know I didn't introduce it in the beginning, but if anybody has any questions online, feel free to leave them on the comments below the video. We have Misha here behind the camera, and he'll read them out to me if we have any.
Twist them up right now.
Yeah, just kind of go back and forth a little and then start twisting it up. So now that we have that curtain sealed up, he's going to take it to the marver here, make sure it's all nice and straight, because you can see both ends are kind of splaying out just a little bit. And that's that nice heat to it. Just want to make sure everything's adhered. There's no gaps or holes on the collar. That's something that tends to happen when rolling up canes. There's so many little kind of divots and crevices that when you roll it up, you may not make that full seal. So he's just rolling kind of back and forth, pushing a little bit, and you can see him slightly actually twisting that glass up. So what's happening is he's rolling it on that marver, and when he's he'll stop in one position just like that and he's twisting to the left. Some of that friction between the glass and the steel is kind of taking over, and it's kind of grabbing onto it and allowing him to create that nice spiralization pattern in the glass. So I imagine you might do that probably a few more times, and then we'll end up closing up the end of this glass. Yeah. So throughout the whole process, you're going to see Jake continually be turning that blowpipe. So whenever we have molten glass coming out of the furnace, or as we have it right now, it's kind of almost in a taffy-like consistency, or like a almost harder honey form. So just kind of a back and forth process, especially with the reheating chamber. As soon as you bring that glass out, even though it's not like 10 degrees out in this room temperature atmosphere, that glass will start cooling down in a matter of minutes to where we can't work with it any longer. And so now it looks like he's going to start sealing up his bubble. You can see him, he's turning out away from his body, and then he'll bring that pipe back. So what he's doing there is he's continuing that twist in the glass. So he twisted it to the left on the marver, and whenever you're turning away from yourself, that's also turning to the left. So he's using those jacks to also kind of constrict down on that, maybe about half of an inch off the head of that to seal it up. I'm going to catch this little flower. This is just a nice little memento to have. Put it away right in the annealer. smoking. So those are, when I first started, I know we called those flowers. I've also heard them as called friggers, F-R-I-G-G-E-R-S. They're just nice little pieces that we can actually reuse later. You can save up enough of those and actually heat them into a sheet just like we did with the canes themselves and roll those up, and it creates a nice kind of very unique decorative pattern of multiple roll-ups. So now it looks like we still got a little bit of texture on that cane. That's what typically happens with it. So now Jake's just gonna let that whole mass get really cold, and when he reintroduces it right into the reheating chamber, it's gonna superheat that surface. So when he either tools it with his jacks or any of his newspaper or the marver, it'll start melting that glass nice and smooth, nice and homogeneous. Because I do believe he's going to be taking one more gather on top of this, because he has about enough glass to make a nice kind of pint glass or a small bowl. But ideally we want to make a larger piece for this demonstration. So just letting that get really hot, or really cold. If we were to go into that furnace with all those little ridges, what it's going to do is glass doesn't flow like water does. It's not going to flow into any of those grooves. It'll actually flow over it, trapping air bubbles. And in this case, it'll be trapping kind of spiraling air bubbles, which could look really cool, but it's not ideal, and that's not what we want in our glass. So he's going to make sure this glass is as smooth as possible. Getting it nice and hot. What we're looking for when we're in that reheating chamber, you can see him, he's not wearing gloves. A lot of glass blowers don't actually wear gloves because it just hinders our dexterity and when we're turning the glass. Now, if we are working on much larger pieces, sometimes a glass blower could wear gloves because their hand may be a little bit more closer in proximity to the glass. But we kind of shy away from doing that because we like having control, and when we're heating the glass up, we're looking for the movement, but we're also feeling it too. So as he's in that reheating chamber, he'll be turning to the right, and as that glass gets hotter, it's going to start kind of lagging or turning towards the left, and we can actually feel that in our blowpipe. There are some glass blowers that do have to wear gloves just because they're actually allergic to the material of the pipes. So our pipes, they can range in different materials. Chromoly typically will build up kind of a gritty surface on the pipe, which allows you to grip it better. Stainless steel, it's not going to tarnish as easily. So each glass blower has their own kind of which one they prefer, kind of preferences. So how are we looking, Jake? We're going to melt it in once more?
Take a dip.
Take a dip? All right. So Jake's now going to let this glass get really cold. We're going to take a gather out of our furnace, kind of taking maybe that final layer. And so he wants to make sure his glass is nice and cold, because if he goes in too hot, that bubble can actually collapse on itself, just due to it not being able to support its own weight. Because those canes those were relatively thin canes. Now, after heating and kind of melting them in and shaping on the marver, he's kind of shrunk his bubble up, or made it kind of nice and small. So that may have thickened up the glass a little bit, but making sure that glass is nice and cold will allow him to control this fresh layer a lot easier. And so you can see that pattern all spiraled together. Now we're going to go in. Every time we go into the furnace and take a gather, we're essentially doubling that original mass we had. Nice. And so even though our pipes are pretty poor conductors of heat, sometimes they do heat up depending on how low the glass is in the furnace. Sometimes we got to spend a little bit longer looking for that glass. So they do heat up. So he's over at our pipe cooler here. It's just a little trough of water that allows them to cool down that pipe and grab closer to that glass. So that's just more leverage that we have on turning it compared to we turned it mainly from where the mouthpiece area is. So now, using one of our fancy blocking tools, this little block or this scoop carved out of wood. So the heads are usually made of a nice fruit wood, kind of like cherry. So as soon as these scoops are carved out, they live their life submerged in water, because when they're brought up and brought in contact with that glass, that water evaporates, creating a little bed of steam that the glass actually gets shaped by. It never makes contact with the wood, unless you dry it out and don't take care of your tools that well. But they're really nice. It allows us to achieve a nice even Q-tip or bullet profile right from that fresh, hot layer of glass from the furnace. So you can see that pattern is now encased. And so right now Jake's hooking up his blow hose. So due to the change in times, what we call the noodle or the blow hose have made quite a comeback. So he's actually going to be applying air pressure himself while he finishes and kind of focuses on the form. Compared to originally, I would not only be taking heats for him, but I would also be sitting at the other end applying air pressure so he can mainly focus, cool down that glass, and see where it's expanding. But as glass blowers, for many years we have to adapt to any new scenario. So he blocked up that glass, kind of evening out the layers a little bit, cooling down that outer molten shell. And now he's getting it all nice and hot again. I imagine he's either going to block the glass again or use his newspaper. And that's just going to cool down that outer layer, developing kind of a cool skin while leaving that core nice and molten. And he'll actually start inflating just a little bit of air into the glass. All right. Maybe after another heat. The hose is kind of, you can get a little tangled up in it depending on also how short the hose length is, especially if it's a really long length. It almost feels like you're getting tangled up in a little jump rope. Bringing it back, opting for the newspaper, which is exactly what it is. It's a newspaper. It's about 5 or 6 sheets folded up into thirds and then into this nice little hand pad here. So it acts the same way as the blocks do. It relies on that little barrier of steam, and you can see the little carbon layer burnt in on the surface of that pad. That kind of helps the glass not really stick to it, but it's really useful for us glass blowers, and it's also the cheapest tool. So just by the way we contort our hand underneath, we can shape that glass up compared to that more rigid profile of the block. So now I know, usually with any setup, we kind of blow out the glass a little bit. Now I believe he's probably going to be taking it over to our big marver, maybe. Yeah, he'll be taking it over to our big marver, which is just a nice slab of steel. I think it's like a mild steel. So he was using the smaller one earlier just to melt in those grooves of the cane. Now he's going to use it for one of their kind of more main purposes of kind of cooling the glass down. So he's primarily going to be rolling the tip of the glass, which will end up being the bottom of this piece, at a higher angle. And then as he reaches over and blows into that glass, or blows into his hose, it's going to inflate the upper 2/3. This is how we can control the thickness, making sure we're sticking with a kind of bottom heavy piece compared to a top heavy piece. Because I know if you have a top heavy piece at home, you have cats wandering around, they're pretty notorious for knocking them over. You need a door? You good? Left side. All right. So we've got some thickness saved on the bottom there. And now before we get too much larger, he's also, like I said earlier, going for this cone form. So he's going to bring it back to the bench at a slight angle. And what that's doing is that thickness on the bottom, you can kind of see, is acting almost as if an anchor. And it's pulling that glass downwards. And he's going to create our constriction line in the glass. So the constriction line is just a little weak point right off the head of the blowpipe that tells the glass where it's going to break. If we didn't have that constriction line in there, we try and break it around to flip it later during the transfer, the glass isn't going to know where to break and can potentially break anywhere. So you can see he did that nice maneuver kind of very swiftly. So now we have that jack line in there. And he's also inflated the form at the same time. So you can see it, it's kind of going into that nice rounder teardrop shape. And in this next heat, I believe he might be getting a little bit more height to it, just kind of stretching it downwards or not. It's all based on what he wants. He just gave me the head nod, so he is going to stretch it out just the slightest bit. So now that we have that constriction line in there, he's mainly going to heat the kind of bottom half of the mass. He doesn't want to heat everything back up because that constriction line is a smaller diameter and will heat up a little bit quicker, and then the form can start moving around like a worm where it's a little bit more uncontrollable. But occasionally he's going to end up going in and out for what we call flashes. That's just keeping everything hot for about maybe 3 or 4 seconds, because the moil or all the glass on the blowpipe is always the last thing to go in and the first thing to come out. So it's never going to absorb as much heat as the bottom is. So you can see him kind of stretching that out, getting some more height to it. That cane looks real nice, like the different color striations going through it. So now to kind of, unless he's going to go for a little bit more stretching, I believe he's going to end up actually going back to the bench, setting up his jacks on the sides, and that's really going to kind of create a nice straight edge, make sure the walls aren't as kind of in a softer form as they are now. Now, people at home might think, oh, he's making a cone. That seems like it's a pretty easy form in glass. And honestly, it's not. It's some of the more simpler forms are some of the more harder ones, actually. Same thing goes for kind of a cylinder. Glass, it likes staying in a rounder form. So to be almost kind of forced into this straight edge shape.
Start to set up to
for the bottom?
round up the bottom, yeah.
Okay. And so when he's adding the kind of blades on the sides, he's spinning really fast. So you want to make sure you're turning really hard. You're not really putting a lot of pressure down with those blades. If you put too much pressure down, you're not turning fast enough, the form can actually start kinking up and creating flat, kind of faceted sides on the form. And so what he did is we're actually going to start kind of flattening of the bottom, so he's turning a little bit faster. That uses a little centrifugal force, kind of pulling in an outwards motion, and makes that base nice and wide, a lot lighter, dude. So I'm coming on with this paddle here. I'm going to come off. So we have the paddle. What we're doing is actually trying to push air into the corners of those edges. And with me coming on flat with a bottom, it allows us to create more of a sharper kind of curvature to the base of this form. Compared to if we were just to flatten it out, him riding the sides with his jacks, it's going to have more of a softer edge. Sorry if that's flaming up too much on you.
It didn't get me at all.
Didn't catch you at all? Cool. So we're going to do it maybe 1 or 2 more times to really kind of crisp up that bottom. So I'm kind of pushing nice and hard. We're rolling back and forth pretty fast, using that force, kind of pulling us in that outwards motion. Good. And there we have that nice crispy edge. And so just using the tips of his jacks, he's adding what we call a little kick into the bottom of the piece. If you've ever been at home and you're looking at a wine bottle, normally wine bottles, they don't sit just on a super flat surface. They have a little indentation. That way they can sit on the rim, the bottom rim of the piece. There's no chance of it kind of wobbling at all. If it was totally flat, it honestly has a better chance of falling over. So you can bring it up, you can see this nice kind of conical cane piece going on. Now we're totally done blowing the piece out. Now is the time where we're actually going to transfer it. So, you ready?
Yep.
All right. So I'm going to take a second, come over here and grab the punty. So we're going to flip this around on our punty, which is just a solid rod. And the punty in Italian, so I've been told, means point. This is just going to be a new temporary contact point to help us finish the top of the piece out. So the transfer can be a relatively stressful part of the process, because when you're first starting out in your first few years, even 5 years in of blowing glass, this is where you will break a lot of it, because you have to break it to make it. So what we're looking for is just a little nice kind of Q-tip shape right off the end. Just kind of like this. So that's the ideal shape. We don't really want to have a nice a blunt head of it, nice and flat, because then that'll make too much surface contact for what we're achieving with this vessel, and it could potentially fuse and maybe break the bottom out. So I'm going to get this a little warmer for him. You're good. You good in still?
Yeah.
Cool. Just getting the right heat. Glass likes sticking to things that's hot. So we both have to be the exact kind of same temperature. Me, I'm going to be a little bit warmer. He's just got to make sure he's all above that kind of 1,000-degree mark. Now he's going to take his tweezers, kind of touch and turn. What he's doing is just kind of winding that onto the bottom. Creates a little additional stress, so it'll break off a little easier later on. Feels good. So I'm just waiting to give him the heads up that I'm good and I can take the piece. He's going to add a little bit of water to that constriction line, and with a tap in the pipe, it breaks free. Beautiful. So I'm going to take just a quick heat for him, bringing it back. You can see still got a lot of movement on that punty. Now this is kind of the second chance we have at making sure this cone or any piece that's made on the punty, or once it's transferred, is nice and straight. So what he's looking for, you saw him kind of go in there with the tweezers. We're just looking for the opening of that piece to be in line with this new punty. Doesn't matter how off any of the shape is, which in this case it's not really off at all. It looks really good. That's just how we know that it's all in the same axis and it is straight. So the reason that happened and how it successfully broke free from the blowpipe is thermal shock. So our glass that we work with what we call a 96 COE. I'll explain that a little bit later, but we work kind of with a softer furnace glass. So our glass is very susceptible to thermal shock. So if you ever want to experience any of that thermal shock at home, you take some ice cubes and put it in a cup of water and it starts cracking and breaking. That's essentially the thermal shock we're dealing with, except on a much kind of hotter scale. So when he added that water to that constriction line, the glass is already a little bit colder, kind of sitting around 1,000, maybe 900 degrees. Adding that water really freezed up that joint, and that tap of vibration sent a little reverberation to that constriction line, which is weak and broke free. So now is one of the longer reheats of the process. So he's going to be in here for roughly about 45 seconds. It feels like a super long time for us just because we're standing in front of that barreling heat. And now this is where we're going to start kind of tweezing and trimming the glass. So using his tweezers, he's starting to kind of pinch and pull in an outwards motion. What that does is it's heightening the glass the slightest bit, but this is also where we're going to be getting rid of that thickness. And as nice as that little floret looks, it has very nice organic appeal to it. It doesn't really jive with the rest of the form, so he's going to end up bonking that off or trimming it. Either of the two. With trimming it, we can do that same motion of tweezing it out, and then we'll take our straight shears, almost like scissors, cut that glass free, so that cuts that thickness away. But on some bigger forms like this, and this is a nice kind of thickness, nice and thin, we're actually going to bonk it. So he's going to create a little constriction line right below that little floret. So this is where the glass, once again, is going to know where it's going to break. But he's squeezing that glass down, and then he's going to switch to the inside, because as he was pushing that glass on the inside of the piece, it creates a little ring. So he goes on the inside and outside to cool down just that one spot. And in a moment, maybe after a heat, he's going to grab it with his diamond shears to kind of cool down that outer edge, and we're just going to do tiny taps to kind of knock that little floret off. Yep.
Go for it. Take a nice long heat.
So, unfortunately, that kind of happens in the glass world. So, when he brought it back, it looked like the bottom got maybe, I think, a little too cold.
Show how thin it is, though.
Yeah, it got a little too cold, so the bottom actually started cracking. Now, that's kind of notorious even for cone forms or stuff with wider bases. You can see that thickness, which is a really great thickness. But a little too thin for the bottom. It happens. So the reason that broke off was just it got a little maybe too cold on the back end. And I was trying to be very gentle with setting that down, but that little bit of vibration caused it to kind of release early from the piece. And that's just something we deal with. So glass happens, it breaks. We've all been studying this for kind of a long time, but we're still very early in our career, so we've barely kind of scratched the surface of glass in general. Honestly, in the first about 5 years, you'll end up breaking a lot of glass, and that's how you really learn. You got to break it to make it, but you break it, you learn from it. Either the glass was too cold, maybe the connection wasn't right, and it just happens. So if that form didn't end up breaking, he would have just finished out. We'd knock that little floret off and open it up. And we bring it on over to our annealing oven, which these annealing ovens are kind of our large boxes that allow us to cool the glass down slowly overnight. So they're holding at roughly about 918 degrees. And as we continue to make glass, we'll keep loading more pieces in there throughout the day, depending on if we're doing kind of a production setting of making work. And it's all holding at that. As soon as we open the door up, put the piece away, and close it, it's going to go back to that temperature. Now, however, when we're done with a day of production or any kind of piece like we were doing today, we're going to send it on that annealing cycle. So I think roughly is our cycle. And that's just because that glass was pretty thin. Now, the thicker the glass is, the longer it takes to cool down. For those of you that have been to the Glass Pavilion, we do have a glass bench in our ancient collection in the center of the room that's actually casted glass. So it wasn't blown at all. It was poured into a mold. And that bench was, I think it's about 3 feet thick at its center point. And that piece actually took about 11 months to cool down. Now, not only because of the thickness of the glass, but it has to cool down evenly from the thickness to those thin edges. So that's why it has to take so long to cool down. But, you know, that's the name of the game. You gotta, it happens. But we have a big round of applause for Jake here. That was a beautiful piece. Nice. I want to thank everybody for tuning in, especially to Owens, Illinois, for sponsoring our demo series here. They've been able to help us keep these demos running kind of virtually, and then for guests that kind of just so happen to wander in and be able to watch it, kind of stay engaged, stay informed. I know, what's it called? We have a little bit more info. We've been doing some sandcasting demonstrations, workshops. We've been doing some sandcasting workshops. So what we have, all the information is online. But basically, we'll send a kit home with you with this little kind of clay mass, and you get to make whatever impressions into that clay. And then once it's sent back, put a little kind of clear layer on it, press it into sand, kind of our foundry sand, And then when we lift it up, we have that negative space that we end up filling with glass. So you get whatever kind of thing that you molded with that clay in glass form. It's really fun. We have more information online, so definitely check it out. Also, please tune back in. We got more demos continually going throughout the week on Wednesday, Friday, and Sundays, all at 2 o'clock. So each kind of demo, we're doing something a little bit differently. So it's a lot of fun. But that's about all I have. If there's any questions online, which it looks like there's none. All right. Well, thank you for joining us today. I hope you have a good rest of your weekend, and we'll see you next time.